Welcome to the Napo Podcast. In this episode, we're taking a look at probation through an international lens. How does probation in England and Wales compare to parole and probation in the United States? What do practitioners on either side of the Atlantic think about rehabilitation, public protection, staff safety, and professional identity? Joining us are Napo activist Andi and Professor Sean Blackwell from College of Idaho, a former probation and parole officer whose experiences in the United States have shaped his research into probation culture and criminal justice reform. Together, they explore the similarities and differences between the two systems, discuss how professional values influence practice, and what each country could learn from each other. Okay, so we are joined by Sean and Andi, and could I get some brief introductions from you guys? Sean, let's go to you first.
Hi, I'm Sean Blackwell. I'm a professor at the College of Idaho, way over in the western United States. I'm the chair of sociology, anthropology, and criminology here, and I've been a criminologist, been a professor for a decade now. And before this, worked in probation. I was a senior probation and parole officer. So that's kind of the background I bring into this job and indeed this podcast. Over to you, Andi.
Hi, my name is Andi Kocsondi and I'm a Napo activist. I wear a lot of different hats. Big shout out to Mercia branch, but I also sit on the National Executive Committee. But perhaps more importantly for today's podcast, I am a qualified probation officer in HMPPS.
What motivated you to get into your respective services?
Well, for me, I had been working in community mental health for about 4 years. I seemed to specialize in working with young men on the autism spectrum. And to be honest, I kind of burned out. The pay was terrible. The hours were inconsistent. And my wife thankfully endorsed me just becoming a temp and leaving without another job. Still thankful to her for that. So I entered a temp agency and I had all these different postings, one of which was working in human resources at the Idaho Department of Correction. While I was there, I got to be a part of this. I actually got to be a part of the conversion process for rehiring a lot of the former private prison officers into the state prison. They retained quite a few of those staff, even though they'd been running what was called a gladiator school. But that's a separate story. So while I was there, I met some lovely people. And one day, this man in a suit came down to us, and I just got to chatting with him. I had a few weeks left and in that particular site, and he invited me to come meet with him. We had been talking about police, and I told him, at this point, I did my master's at the LSC. I'd moved back to the States, and he was asking, "Have you ever thought about being a cop?" And I was like, "No, I actually kind of hate cops. I really have the heart of a social worker," all that kind of stuff. And he's like, "Brilliant." So he walks away, and the administrative assistant who was sitting there says, "You should put a suit on and go meet with him. That's the chief of probation and parole for the entire state." And I did. And he told me that he was at that time actively engaged in a process of trying to adjust or change the culture of probation in Idaho, because it was so firmly rooted in sort of a law enforcement identity, power and control, public protection. There was such a one-sided ethos at play there, and he wanted me to consider being a part of the change. So I said, great. Went on a ride-along, applied for the job. So a ride-along, is when you go ride with an officer in the field. And next thing I knew, I was a PO, and boy, did I learn a lot. I was carrying a gun and a badge and doing all that stuff and arresting people, but somehow I was also, getting to do mental health sort of work and be a social worker in the ways that felt right to me. So I found it very rewarding. Andi.
I think that was really interesting, Sean. I even learnt some stuff about that journey that I didn't know about you from before. I think we connected back in 2021 because of your article that was published. For those people who are listening and haven't read the article yet, it's called "Guys, Get Your Guns Out," and it was published in the Probation Journal probably back in 20 or 21, something like that. I think what motivated me to become a probation officer is quite similar to kind of the drivers that you described, Sean. I came from a mental health background, so I did a degree in psychology and criminology, and I worked in schools first, working with children and young adults with special educational needs. And then I moved into secure mental health hospitals as a healthcare assistant. So I worked on different wards, both in the NHS and in private hospitals as well. So I've always known that I wanted to do something with rehabilitation and helping people in need, helping vulnerable people. But I just wasn't quite sure what it was exactly until I went back to uni to do my master's in clinical psychology. And I went on a placement. It was a clinical placement at a drug and alcohol service in Swansea. And despite having studied criminology for years prior to that, I had no awareness of the probation service. And I think we often say this in the UK, that the public aren't really aware of what we do. You know, people know what the police do, what courts do, what the prisons do. But when it comes to probation, we're kind of this hidden service. So that was my first exposure to working alongside a probation officer when I was on placement in this substance misuse service. And I just saw how much good they were doing, the special relationship, the positive working relationship that they built up with their service users. And the beauty of the role to me was that you're this first point of contact for that person. You know, you're the first one they come to for help. And sometimes that can be the difficulty of the job as well, because you're wearing so many different hats. You're a social worker, you're a housing officer, you're a therapist, all in one. But I think it was a role that stood out to me that's really unique and very varied and multifaceted. So I was hooked. A few months later, after I finished my master's, I applied for the PQIP, which is the probation officer training in the UK.
I guess while we're here, for people who don't know, how do you end up on parole in the States or probation in the UK, and what kind of requirements or conditions do people accessing the services typically have?
So in the States, we have felony and misdemeanor probation. So that will be court ordered, just like in the UK, court ordered by a judge. Will be treated as a suspended sentence. So think of like the sword of Damocles. And if you don't abide by the conditions, eventually the days of one dirty urine test are gone. But eventually, if you earn sort of enough violation points, then the judge can revoke probation and then send you to prison to do at least part of your prison sentence. So parole policies are actually really variable in the United States because of our federal system. Each of the states has its own particular flavor of parole, and some states actually don't have parole. But Idaho does make use of it, as do many other states. And our policy is we use a mixed indeterminate and determinate sentencing structure. So you don't get just a 10-year sentence and you don't get just some massive range the judge can pick from. They say, 2 to 5 years in prison. So in Idaho, you have to serve 150% of your minimum sentence. So once you've done that, maybe 3 out of that 5 years, then you're eligible for parole. But parole in Idaho this is also something pretty variable across the US, is discretionary. So some places you go up for a parole hearing, and unless you just have some massive string of policy violations, disciplinary orders, all that kind of thing, you're going to get out. In Idaho, the parole board has total authority. They don't have to give any reasoning behind their decision. They hear your case and decide whether or not you're allowed to go out into the community. And also something a little bit different about us is in many states, probation and parole are separated out. California has state parole agents, and then counties have their own individual probation offices. In Idaho, the counties handle misdemeanor probation. And then for felony probation and parole, those are actually handled by the same officers. So I was a probation and a parole officer. The conditions tend to be relatively similar across both populations. No drinking, which has been a controversial policy for many years. I think it was only in 2011 or something that the then director of the parole commission decided that alcohol was just too problematic, whether or not it had any relation to the underlying offense. But no booze, no illegal drugs, no drugs of any kind without a prescription. Report as ordered. If your PO tells you be in my office at 8 in the morning, theoretically, if you don't show up, that's an arrestable offense. It's not always official. POs have discretion over romantic relationships. You often have to report who you're dating, who you're sleeping with. You have to report residence. You cannot move without permission from your PO. You have to continually maintain some kind of full-time employment, but you can't quit your job. If you're fired, then of course that becomes a violation. Sometimes curfews. I know in the US and in the UK, most justice-involved people are going to have co-occurring disorder of some kind of substance abuse disorder and mental health disorder. So you got to go to treatment, got to finish your programming. And for many of them, you can't drive. They'll have revoked driving licenses, which is a major challenge in a place like Idaho. Oh, and you can't have weapons. No guns once you're convicted of a felony.
Wow. I mean, some of those restrictions, I guess, and conditions I'm not surprised by because they're quite similar in England and Wales as well. But some of them are quite surprising. So just for people who might not be aware, in England and Wales, we have a separate system from Scotland and Northern Ireland. So sentencing and the probation service and how we operate, they're not uniform across the 4 countries. So I can only speak about England and Wales because I'm not that familiar about Scotland and Northern Ireland. But here we have community-based sentences and we have custodial sentences, just to make it simple. Community-based sentences are normally given out for more minor offences, and they can come with what we call rehabilitation activity requirement days, which, let's say, the magistrates or the sentences, whether it's a judge or magistrate, but they say that this person needs to spend 30 days doing some rehabilitative activity, for example. Sentences also need to have a punitive element, so they might get a fine, curfew, which can be electronically monitored, and that's becoming more and more popular and more widely used. Or it could be unpaid work, which is also used to be called community payback or community service, where people who are convicted, they go out and work for free in the community, and they're normally given anywhere between sort of 50 to 250 hours or 300 hours. And so throughout their sentence, they have to go and do that. Community sentences don't come with a long list of restrictions. Obviously, they have to attend their appointments and they might go through drug testing and they might have some interventions to complete. If they fail to do that, then they're not sent to custody, they're sent back to court, and it's for the sentences to decide whether to extend their community order or revoke it and potentially re-sentence them. And that could be an outcome, especially if somebody is non-compliant like multiple times over a long period of time. We also have suspended sentences where people are given a custodial sentence, but they are suspended and the person is allowed to remain in the community. And until that custodial element of the sentence is activated, it is pretty much like a community order. The difference is that if they're in breach, they're not compliant with their appointments and their requirements, then that kind of imprisonment time that can be activated. So that's basically the community-based orders. And then you've got the custodial sentences. And I think when Sean and I first talked, we had to figure out the lingo because we use different language for different things. So I think when you were saying somebody was on parole, you kind of meant somebody was on license. That's what we call it. And so that's when people get either a determinate sentence in custody, so it's a set time, you get 5 years or 10 years, or people can have indeterminate sentences as well. So, for example, a life sentence for very, very serious offences. So when those individuals come out from custody, they have a long list of conditions to stick to. So the monitoring is a lot more intense. And there's normally 9 standard conditions, which are very similar to what Sean described. You know, you can't change residence without approval. You can't leave the country. You have to be on good behaviour in general. But then you've got additional conditions which are related to your offence. So it could be that if it's alcohol or drug related, then there is drug and alcohol testing. We've also got monitoring equipment now. They're like ankle tags that monitor alcohol in the sweat of the individual. So it can measure that. And we also more and more using GPS monitoring as well. So that's increasing in the UK. But we have several other conditions that I think the list just goes on, and it just depends on the individual. The kind of idea is that we have to be proportionate and we can only put in place things that are absolutely necessary. So I think, Sean, some of the conditions that you're describing, it's kind of for everybody, isn't it? Like, even if you don't have an alcohol problem, you're not allowed to drink, potentially for years if you're on parole, which is quite restrictive and disproportionately restrictive. So if we put in a condition that somebody is not allowed to have alcohol at all, that can only be for a short period of time. So I think there's quite a lot of similarities, but also a lot of differences.
One thing I wanted to ask you, I'm curious about that I forgot to mention for conditions was here, there are pretty wide allowances for searches. So you actually have to waive, if you're a client, you have to waive your 4th, 5th, and 6th Amendment rights. So you actually waive the right to lie to your PO. If you're caught lying, that can be used to arrest. Hearsay can be used against you, which is, I think, massive. Some of our guys were, lads, if you will, and they would have multiple baby mamas out there. And sometimes baby mamas would call in, just trying to get them in trouble for whatever reason, the whole range of legitimate to childish. And our job was to sort through that because we could use that hearsay against them, even if there was no evidence backing that up at all. Isn't that frightening? I think that's frightening. But also we could, we had to do home visits, or compliance monitoring, depending on which PO you were talking to. So they had to waive their rights to search. They had to allow us into their homes 24 hours a day. And if they did not consent to the search, that was an immediate arrest. And I mean, before I left, they'd started to wind this down. But then it became common areas and the offender's bedroom. And they wanted us to start going out before 10 p.m. and try to calibrate it a little bit differently. So that's actually, Andy, something I've always wondered about the UK. Do you have a PO banging on your door at 2 a.m, searching your whole place, looking for weapons, maybe even detaining you in handcuffs on the couch while your place is searched?
So I'm glad that you brought that up, because I think the powers in the US and in the UK, they are wildly different. So us in England and Wales, we do not carry a weapon. We do not carry handcuffs. We do not carry anything, to be honest. No, absolutely nothing. We have a personal safety device, and that's it, to kind of protect ourselves and to be able to kind of signal for help. We do not carry weapons, and we cannot arrest individuals. That's the police's job. So in terms of the powers to enforce a home visit, we do not have that. I would go to a home visit unannounced, not 3 o'clock in the morning at all. I would turn up at a reasonable time, and they can choose to not let me in that moment. However, there would be some sort of consequences to that. So obviously we'd have a conversation afterwards about why that happened. It would raise alarm bells. So you might end up doing more intelligence checks and also working alongside the police to investigate whether there's any cause for concern.
Do you know what? Just listening to you both speak about the powers that you have, it made me wonder a little bit about the culture and the professional identity that goes along with that.
Well, I'm writing a book about this, which was basically my total failure to be somebody different within that system. That's what the PhD was about. That's part of what that article was about, because I'm fascinated with the ways that sort of what I call, and many other calls, actually the British dominate this field in wonderful ways. But the way that occupational culture influences reform implementation, right? Because we can all pick up the Howard report or whatever and read about some great reform, that some professor, some policymaker has promulgated and they've started to implement. And there's sort of I'm going to sound like a Marxist here, I know, but there's sort of like a champagne set that's going to meet in posh restaurants and talk about it and mull it over and celebrate how great this new reform is. But that is completely out of touch with what is happening on the ground, with officers sat there with clients, offenders, service users, whatever you want to call them, day in and day out, trying to figure out what is the right way to help these guys navigate the supervision experience. In Idaho, it definitely leaned much more towards the punitive side. Any kind of non-compliance or resistance became, I think, framed not only as disobedient, but also dangerous, right? And a resistant client is a dangerous client, someone who's not only kind of addressing this nebulous sense of public safety, but also specifically like they might now try to kill you, because they're not doing what you told them to do. And that's, I mean, again, that's kind of why I was brought into probation, because I was a peacemaker. I still am, Yes, I had to learn how to beat people up and shoot guns and all that kind of stuff. But, my job was to talk to people. Like, that's what I'm good at. And that was in opposition to the way that many of my partners felt that they should do their job. In fact, I got in trouble once for using the word client. My supervisor, who was a Democrat, by the way, she went on one day about how, we have to call them offenders because they have offended against the state of Idaho. They have offended our sensibilities. They've offended the law. And, at this point, I'm thinking there's nothing inherently offensive about somebody who has an addiction issue. Like, that makes no sense. I mean, if we're talking about a pedophile, fine, I get it. People who were disproportionately poor. Idaho's not very diverse. I know in most other states you see a much more racial disparity, many more black men, young black men especially, on probation and parole. Statistically in Idaho, we do see an overrepresentation of black folks in our prisons. But you don't really visually see that just because we're such a white state. You will see more Hispanic, Latine folks when you get out of Boise, the capital city, which is where I worked. But besides racial inequality, I mean, our clients were mostly poor, undereducated folks struggling with mental illness and addiction, not inherently dangerous people. But the discourse was one of policing. A lot of POs were guys who couldn't hack it as police. They couldn't get hired as police. So the second best option was to become a probation parole officer. You could carry a gun. You could wield this really much greater authority than police have over your clients. Talk to them however you please and kind of shore up this thin blue line sensibility about you being this great warrior protecting the public from monsters. So I had to carve out my own space to be someone who just wanted to see people who were hurting get better. We were shuffling paper all day. We were writing endless reports, moving at breakneck speed with huge caseloads, just barely keeping up with a relentless onslaught of bureaucratic demands. That was the reality of the job. But the culture around the job was this warrior mentality. I will pass it over for Andi to give us the sunshine of the British model.
Thanks, Sean. It will sound like sunshine compared to that because I think we are very, very different in terms of our culture and professional identity in the UK. And I'm confident to say that applies to Scotland and Northern Ireland as well. So I don't know how much you know about kind of the origins of probation service, but it originated in 7, something like that. And it started out as, I believe, a Christian missionary kind of project where it was volunteers working in the community trying to support those particularly who had alcohol problems, and that was part of the reason why they were offending if they had issues securing employment, and that factored into why they were committing offences. And it was more of a kind of voluntary advocacy and mentoring kind of service at the time. And then obviously fast forward, we did become a statutory service. But our kind of motto was advise, assist and befriend. That was the principle behind probation. That's what we were there for, advising people, guiding them, supporting them. We moved away from that in the early 2000s as we started to pick up more of the public protection function, and we started to do more risk management and more enforcement and more kind of punishment as such. So the function of probation kind of has shifted, but the underlying social worker values have remained, and that's still the case now. So even though we changed the training pathway. So we used to have to train as a social worker, and then you'd do like an added placement in the criminal justice system as a PO, and you'd have to have a social worker qualification to practice as a PO later on. That changed in the mid-90s. So that's no longer the case. We have our own training pathway. In Scotland, I believe it's still the same. So social workers work as POs. But even though in England and Wales, we split the training pathway, most, and I'd say probably 99% of people that I come across who come through the door to train to be POs or work in other roles as well in probation, they're very social worker minded. So if you ask them what drove them to apply, they will be saying it's the desire to help. Most people that I meet, professionals and colleagues, they are incredibly empathetic, very compassionate. Majority of probation officers are women. So we have a majority female staff group. And so there is that caring attitude to all the supervision and all the interaction that we do with service users. Definitely not a warrior kind of mentality. And what I would say is that even though we have moved more and more towards public protection, the workforce are still so stubbornly clinging to that social worker identity. And we're very much resistant of overly punitive approaches. I think we're very much focused on desistance and strengths-based approaches, trauma-informed care, making sure that we're taking into account the traumatic experiences of that person, any kind of responsivity needs that they have. So, for example, neurodivergence, mental health issues, addiction. We're very much still trying to be personalised and individualised to make sure that we provide the best care. And I think ultimately, that is the big question, isn't it? Often in research and in policy, what works? Does it work to be really punitive or does it work to be more rehabilitative? And I think rehabilitation is the key to reducing reoffending. And I think that's something that both the US and the UK system, we want to achieve a reduction in offending and a reduction in people experiencing harm. So I think rehabilitation is absolutely key to that, and most probation staff in the UK would agree with that.
I was just going to ask, because over here, we have been in a massive pay and workloads campaign for our members. Probation staff in the UK are grossly underpaid, overworked. What are the conditions for staff in the US that are working in parole or probation?
That's a great question. It depends widely on where you are. If you're so in Idaho, I started off, I think like $7.29 an hour. No, below that. I was 16.76 or 16.67. So I made under $17 an hour. By the time I left, I think I was up to $19.25. I'd promoted, but that's nothing. That's like 13 quid an hour, right? Who can live on that? And just like British workers, I was working my butt off all the time, never caught up, relentless workload. I think the pay is better now. One of my old students became a PO. I think he was starting off around like 45,000, 48,000. But that's still, if you compare that to a police officer locally, right here in Caldwell, where I am, just outside of Boise, I think an average police officer, day one, can't even carry a gun yet, is going to start around 58. To make that kind of money in probation parole, I'd be a lifer. I'm 40 now. I doubt I would touch that pay until I was 45 or 50. And those would all be cost of living adjustments. Do you guys have COLAs in the UK? I'm sure there's a different term for them. You coined it first. I know we're just the children in the US. But if you're getting 3% a year, that's not even covering inflation. So you actually end up losing money over time, right? Great health benefits, I have to say. Working for the state, that was one of the reasons many people would stay in as lifers. Idaho, believe it or not, as backward as we are, and we have one of the best retirement systems in the world, one of the best pension schemes in the world. So a lot of folks would say, if I can just batten down the hatches and make it till I'm 52, I can have a pretty sweet retirement. The problem is they're having a cardiac arrest when they're 54 because they've been stressed out for the last 35 years. In other places, the pay is better. I know California and Oregon, there's a county in Oregon, which is the next state to the west of us, probably 4-hour drive away. I think those POs were starting at like 65 or something. 65,000 a year, much better pay. So it just varies widely. As far as caps on working hours, theoretically, you worked 40 hours a week. Sometimes you could get approved overtime, but I think like many of us, I definitely sometimes worked off the clock because I had to, not because I was trying to break the law, but because I had to get this report into this judge or that supervisor or whatever and get it done. There was a heavy emphasis on safety, which I came to appreciate after I did work with some people who were pretty dangerous, who did want to hurt me. I did learn to appreciate that side of things, I should say, with humility. Like I think I came away a more balanced person. I was kind of this like, kind of angry anarchist, total lefty going into this profession. And a lot of that is still there, but I did learn to appreciate that, like, wow, some of these guys are bad dudes and they're never going to get their life together. They're always going to try to kill us or hurt us. And they were, that's the problem with working in a public protection agency. They were pretty good about making sure that we were safe. Even though our equipment was super old, the first gun I was issued was so old that it actually broke in my holster when I was getting out of my mother-in-law's car, and it shot a bullet through the bottom of her car into my training officer's driveway. And I'm not making this up. This is such an American story, I know. But yeah, like the equipment was so old that it was literally falling apart. But they still tried to make sure that we felt safe and supported. They were good about that. But the pace was relentless. They really did try to make sure we were adequately staffed. But when I was there, the turnover rate was so high, well over 20%, that you would get all these unsupervised caseloads. Folks would leave after 6 months, a year, 3 years, and then somebody had to watch those clients. And that sort of snowballed for a lot of us and was dreadful. And things would fall through the cracks, right? If you can't watch someone closely enough, then they are going to relapse and kill people and all the other kinds of things that rise through the media. But yeah, there is no union. Idaho is a radically anti-union state. And politically, we were at one point the most politically conservative state in the United States. Paradoxically, guess who the most powerful union in the state is? It's the Boise Police Department. So all those frickin' hypocrites roll around all day talking about libtards and their stupid unions, et cetera, et cetera. Meanwhile, they have an amazing union that totally protects them, that makes sure they get paid exceptionally well. They make a lot of money. They have fabulous working conditions. They have all the things that we know can come out of a union. And that was not going to happen for us in PNP. And I kind of doubt it ever will. I would be shocked if I ever saw a union of correctional officers and probation parole officers here in Idaho.
Do you think people would be open to having a union though? So is it, because to me it's such an alien concept. You're shaking your head.
All they think of when they think of unions is like Tammany Hall and Chicago corruption. There's so many anti-union scripts that I personally would not know where to begin with that. I mean, the resistance is so strong at the outset. And so Idaho is what we call a right to work state. Right to work, what it actually means is right to fire. In Idaho, you're always an at-will employee. You can be fired without cause at any moment. You have zero protection. So unions are kind of useless in that way. And I think even pragmatically, that's one of the reasons that they don't catch on here, because the law is on the side of the employer. They can sit there and shake their fist and protest outside the office all they want, but the reality is there's a different way you have to work in that system.
I find that quite interesting, what you're saying about the legislation being so anti-worker and making it so difficult to get workers' rights. And I just think about Napo's activity. Yes, unions cannot dictate law changes, but they can definitely influence it. So I do wonder whether if there was a collective of government workers, whether that's in the probation department or any other department, and there was that collective power and movement and mobilisation, whether that could influence policy and how that goes forward. I think back to our pay campaign with Napo, and they had meetings with the Deputy Prime Minister, so it goes all the way up. So unions can, I think, be so powerful even outside the workplace. We often think about it as an insurance policy in the workplace, but I think unions are so much more. So I do wonder whether it could change things, but obviously people are really resistant to it. Similarly to what you were saying about the parole officer's resistance to anything rehabilitative or any kind of shift in working with people in a relational manner rather than the punitive manner.
I mean, and admittedly, I am a bit of an Anglophile. I love the UK. I've lived there. briefly. I think this is a way in which, my British friends are just kind of superior to Americans. I think there's just a much healthier culture there of political engagement and engagement between constituents and representatives. Whereas what I observe here is sort of alienation. I think there's definitely sort of a disjuncture between the voices of the people, if you will, and those who operate in those hallways. And I've seen this personally, because I've been homeless in my own life multiple times. And I remember serving on this panel with someone who would go on to become a state senator, who was is a lovely human, a great person, but we so clearly were speaking completely different languages. It's like an American who thinks they know what a British accent sounds like, and then they go to like the north of England, right? And they've never heard how real British people speak. And we were just talking across each other. She very much had this sort of top-down, bougie, policy-level, wealthy way of thinking about things. And I very much came from like bottom-up, lived experience, hard realities of life, giving voice to people. But there was not much to bridge that. It was sort of nodding along aside each other on a panel and then going our separate ways. And I think that's how a lot of politics work in Idaho. There's very little representation. I think wealthy, powerful people, by and large, operate within similar circles, and they make policy that they think will be best for the ignorant masses below them.
I think that's a good place to round this up with my final question. If you both think politically, professionally, what thing or things do you think you could borrow from the other side of the pond and bring to your place that you think would have like real benefit to the staff and the clients that you serve?
That's a really good question. I think Sean made a really good point about staff safety. And although the kind of safety measures that they use across the pond in probation are not particularly suitable for us, I'm absolutely not advocating to carry a gun. You don't want to see me with a gun. I'd be a terrible shot and a risk to staff, probably. So that wouldn't be a good idea. But I think the prioritization of staff safety, keeping people safe whilst they do this really, really important job, I think that's a really good principle to have. For those people who are listening and might not be aware, we've had quite a significant increase in violent incidents against probation officers in the UK. We had some quite major incidents, including stabbings. You might be aware that because in the UK there aren't as many guns, obviously it's not as available as in the US. We have a lot more knife crime, and that's a big issue that obviously the police and the government have been trying to tackle and reduce for such a long time. But yeah, so staff in probation are feeling quite unsafe. I think in the past 12 months particularly, these sort of incidents weren't really there in the past. I mean, there might have been some violence and aggression towards officers, but this is just, I think the extent of it is different. The atmosphere feels different in certain places. And without kind of going into a very lengthy speech, I think there's a number of reasons for that. People are desperate. Policies are changing all the time. They don't know whether they're coming or going. There were so many changes introduced to sentencing and recalls to custody. There's austerity, the cost of living crisis. Public services are all on their knees. It's not just probation, but mental health services, the NHS, children's services. So I think there is this growing desperation, frustration and anger in communities for these reasons. And so when we're seeing an increase of attacks on staff, I feel like maybe we are not as prepared to keep our workers safe, to keep our probation staff saved. And Napo are doing a wonderful job advocating again for our safety. So that's absolutely a union matter. So again, we kind of unite over that as the membership kind of sees all the work that they put into it. But I guess that would be the one thing that maybe from the US model we could implement something more about staff safety and putting staff first, because our staff dedicate their entire lives to this work and, they're so committed to making a difference. And yeah, they should feel protected at all times.
If I can ask a follow-up really quick. I mean, I'm curious. So y'all don't arrest. I mean, we arrest, right? We've got the gun in the use of force gear, and that's most of the uses of force that are going to take place. Since you guys don't arrest, I mean, do you have a sense of what's leading to those use of force incidents, those attacks?
When you say what's leading to them, what do
You
you
know,
mean?
are folks like upset attacking an officer because they're going to be recalled or they're going to recommend revocation? Is it just misogynist violence against a female officer? I'm just curious if there's any sense of what might be motivating those attacks.
Right, I've got you. I think all the circumstances have been different so far. In some incidents, there was almost no rhyme or reason to why that person was so determined to cause harm. Whereas in other cases that I've heard from colleagues, there's a very clear rationale really why that person acted in that way. So for example, they were just told that they're, as you said, being recalled, or they were just told you can't see your children. So there's something really emotive happened that's impacting on them, which is why they react in that way. But I think in some incidents, there's just no rhyme or reason that we can immediately see. Obviously, I'm not part of the investigations in those circumstances. But yeah, none of them are triggered by staff's kind of abrupt or aggressive behaviour, like in the US where you would knock down someone's door at 3 o'clock in the morning. Honestly, I'm not surprised that the assault rates are that high because people are sleeping, and especially we know when we work with traumatized people, some of those people would have a proper flashback reaction to things. But yeah, in our incidents, that's not the case.
Well, remarkably, the actual this is something I'm writing about too. The actual rate of assaults on probation and parole staff was very low. And I think it's because maybe we had the support to make ourselves safe. As for the UK, I mean, obviously we have a lot to learn from the UK in so many ways, parliamentary democracy, killing the two-party system. But beyond all that, for probation and parole, that there has to be a centering of empathy and I think a fundamental belief in a human being's capacity to change. There was so much cynicism around that. And I always found it shocking and insulting because I grew up in a family of folks with drug addiction issues. I had been a juvenile delinquent. I was excluded from school when I was 13. I was in and out of trouble, kind of a bad kid. And like most juvenile delinquents, I aged out of it just fine because I had mentors who believed in me, people who saw strength instead of deficit, saw potential. And so it was bizarre to me that we wouldn't view these clients that way. That was not our stance towards people who were trying to conquer, the methamphetamine or trying to conquer the booze, whatever it may be. To do the PhD in criminology, I had to read reams and reams and reams of studies out of the UK on British probation. And I was just astonished by how humanizing it was and how resilient that occupational culture was too, right? There was a real strong impulse, just like in the US, in the opposite direction, to hang on to that advise, assist, befriend, to find ways to move past like the centering of risk, right? And bureaucratic efficiency. And I think that ethos is what we need. If you're not going to see a human being in pain in front of you first, give them the space to prove otherwise if they are a dangerous, bad person. But if you're not going to start out with that fundamental orientation, then what the hell do you expect? Why should you be surprised when they fail, when you arrest them, when they try to punch you in the face, when they call you names, when they go beat their wife again, whatever it may be, however they act out on that? I'm not saying that's our fault, but my God, you can certainly create a different context professionally. And it seems to me that British POs have that mastered. And I wish we could develop a better therapeutic alliance with clients here. Again, I hear it's happening. I'll believe it when I see it. If what I'm being told is true, then maybe there's hope for the future of probation and parole in Idaho.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Napo Podcast. If you've enjoyed the conversation, please subscribe, leave a comment, and share the episode with colleagues and friends. You can find more podcasts, news, and campaigning updates on the Napo magazine. Napo continues to campaign for safe workloads, fair pay, and a probation service that gives staff the time, resources, and support they need to make a difference. Until next time, thank you for listening.